You wake up when your body is ready. No alarm, no boss waiting on a reply. No rent due at the end of the month. You spend maybe 4 hours today finding food. The rest of the day is yours. Now picture the version of history where this never stopped, where nobody ever knelt down and pressed a seed into the dirt on purpose, where farming, the thing you assume built civilization, simply never happened. What would that world actually look like? And more strangely, would it be worse? For most of the roughly Becham years Homo sapiens have existed, nobody farmed. People hunted, gathered, fished, and moved with the seasons. Then, starting around high years ago in a handful of separate regions, something changed. Small groups began planting crops on purpose. Slowly, farming spread, and within a few thousand years, most of humanity had shifted from foraging to fields. It's tempting to assume that shift was obviously an upgrade. More food, more people, more stuff. But here's the question this video is built around. What if it hadn't happened at all? What would your life look like if agriculture had simply never been invented? Let's start with what the evidence actually says about life before farming, because it's not what most people expect. In 1975, anthropologist Richard Lee spent time studying the Jews in Hoansi, a hunter-gatherer people in the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa. He tracked exactly how many hours adults spent obtaining food each week. The number came out to roughly 200 hours, not hours a day. A week that's less than half of a standard modern work week. And it doesn't count for one crucial detail. This wasn't a fluke of one lucky group in one lucky place. Similar patterns have shown up across multiple hunter-gatherer society studies since, from the Hadza in Tanzania to Aboriginal groups in Australia. Foraging, when you have enough space and enough biodiversity, is often shockingly efficient. Compare that to what happened once farming took hold. Anthropologist George R. Milego spent decades studying skeletal remains from a site called Dixon Mounds in Illinois, where the population transitioned from foraging to corn agriculture around 1,000 years ago. His research found something striking. After the shift to farming, life expectancy dropped. Signs of malnutrition increased. Tooth decay, once rare, became common because grain-heavy diets are worse for teeth than the varied wild foods people ate before. Skeletons from early farming communities are, on average, shorter and show more evidence of disease than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Political scientist James Sescott, in his research on the earliest agricultural states, points out something else easy to miss. Early farming villages weren't just less healthy, they were more vulnerable. A hunter-gatherer band could simply walk away from a bad season, a conflict, or a disease outbreak. A farming village was tied to its fields, its stored grain, and eventually to the people who controlled that stored grain. Scott argues that the earliest states didn't just emerge alongside agriculture. They depended on it because grain, unlike wild food, can be counted, taxed, and confiscated. So let's reconstruct what a world without agriculture might actually look like, using what we know from societies that never adopted it, or adopted it much later. Picture bands of maybe high Victorian people moving through a landscape they know intimately, time to the ripening of specific plants and the migration of specific animals. Nobody owns the land in the way you think of ownership. Food is shared constantly, because storing up a personal surplus makes little sense when you're moving every few weeks and when sharing builds the social debts that keep you alive during a bad hunt. Children are raised communally, watched by whichever adults happen to be nearby. Status exists, but it's harder to turn into permanent power because there's no granary to seize, no fixed address to tax, no way to trap people in place through debt. Work is real, and it's not always easy. There are droughts, predators, injuries with no modern medicine to treat them. But the day-to-day rhythm looks less like a grinding shift and more like a series of tasks interspersed with rest, conversation, and enormous amounts of unstructured time. Now here's the counterintuitive twist, the part that flips the whole question on its head. If foraging was healthier, less time-consuming, and arguably more egalitarian, why did farming ever spread at all? The uncomfortable answer many researchers now favor is that agriculture didn't spread because it made individual lives better. It spread because it produced more calories per acre, which meant more people, which meant farming populations could outproduce and eventually outcompete or absorb neighboring foragers, even while individual farmers were, on average, sicker, shorter, and working harder than their hunter-gatherer neighbors. Agriculture wasn't selected for improving your life, it was selected for out-reproducing everyone around you. In other words, you may be descended from farmers, not because farming was better for the individual, but because it won at the population level, generation after generation, until foraging simply ran out of room. If agriculture had never been invented, most of what defines your daily life would not exist. No cities, in the dense permanent sense you know them, because cities depend on centralized food surplus. No large-scale governments, because Scott's research suggests state power grew directly out of the ability to tax stored grain. Global population would likely have stayed in the low millions rather than the billions, simply because foraging cannot support anywhere near the population density that farming can. You, statistically, might not exist at all, since the explosive population growth agriculture enabled is a big part of why there are billions of humans alive today instead of a few million scattered bands. And yet the people in that world would very likely work fewer hours, eat a more varied diet, and show fewer signs of chronic disease than the average person did for most of the following 10,000 years of farming life. This isn't a case for abandoning modern life. Vaccines, antibiotics, and modern medicine have pushed life expectancy far beyond what any forager or early farmer experienced. But it is worth sitting with the strange fact that the invention, often credited as the foundation of civilization, made individual human lives measurably harder for thousands of years before things eventually improved. Think about your own relationship to time and food. Tingmilamto Jaime hour work week that seemed almost impossible when you heard Richard Lee's number. That wasn't a primitive limitation. In some very real sense, it was closer to what your body evolved to expect. Every time you feel crushed by an enemy hour work week or trapped by rent or anxious about stored wealth you don't actually have, you're feeling the specific downstream pressure of the system that started with someone pressing a seed into the ground 12,000 years ago. You wake up when your alarm goes off. Bills are due at the end of the month. Your job is waiting on a reply. None of that was inevitable. It was one specific choice, made independently in a handful of places, that happened to outcompete every alternative. Somewhere in a version of history that never happened, you might have woken up with nowhere you needed to be.